Welcome to Anews. I'm Omar Taslim, and you're watching Türkiye Diplomacy. With global fault lines deepening, the Middle East, Ukraine, and Iran have all entered a dangerous new phase. On today's episode, we'll examine Trump's surprise announcement of a 60-day ceasefire deal in Gaza, his decision to halt weapons to Ukraine, and the fallout from the U.S.-Israeli strikes on Iran's nuclear sites. Joining me to discuss these developments are Anews editor Mustafa Kocakenar and Issue Insights senior research editor John Kavalich.
U.S. President Donald Trump announced on Tuesday that Israel has agreed to the conditions necessary to finalize a 60-day ceasefire in Gaza, in an effort to end months of conflict in the Palestinian enclave. Trump credited Qatar and Egypt for their roles in brokering the talks, calling their efforts very hard to help bring peace, and said they would deliver the final proposal to Hamas. Trump warned in the Post that, quote, "I hope, for the good of the Middle East, that Hamas takes this deal, because it will not get better, it will only get worse." It was not immediately clear what specific terms had been agreed upon, or when the ceasefire might formally take effect. The announcement follows weeks of intense diplomacy aimed at halting Israeli military operations in Gaza and facilitating humanitarian relief for Palestinian civilians caught in the fighting. Qatari and Egyptian mediators have repeatedly worked to negotiate pauses in the conflict, which has caused heavy casualties and extensive damage in Gaza. The administration has made ending the war a foreign policy priority, with Trump vowing to reach a broader settlement to stabilize the region.
Welcome back to the program. Mustafa Kocakenar, John Kavalich. Gentlemen, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Good morning, Omar.
John, I'll start with you. Let's talk about the 60-day ceasefire that President Donald Trump has floated, this idea which he says that Israel has agreed to. You know, last Friday, we were hearing reports from the United States that President Trump could initiate the ceasefire as soon as, within a week as well. So, John, I'm going to start with you. Please tell me, how are you looking at this announcement? Because now, it's a much-needed ceasefire. Over 56,000 people have been killed in the occupied Gaza Strip, and the Israeli attacks are ongoing. There's no stopping the Israeli government from killing innocent Palestinian civilians. How are you looking at this ceasefire proposal? I don't know if I should call it a proposal or if it's confirmed right now, because Israel has agreed to it, and now Trump is saying that Hamas has to accept this ceasefire. What do you think about it?
Well, first, I'm not so certain that Israel has agreed to it, because what President Trump says Israel has agreed to isn't always what Israel has agreed to, and Israel has changed its mind as the facts on the ground continue to change. So I'm not optimistic that that they're going to be able to complete it, and two, that they're going to be able to maintain it, and then three, that we're not unlikely, or we are likely to see another one. Because what does this truly do for 60 days? If it's about all the hostages, living and dead, get out, okay. But then if you're Hamas, now the IDF has a free rein to do what they want. And, sort of to put it in perspective, the numbers that have been put out around, almost 60,000 as far as, dead, about 130 plus thousand wounded. So you're basically looking at 200,000 impact. And October 7th, 2023, you had about, 1,200 Israelis that were killed. So right now we're looking at almost a 200-to-1 ratio. So for every Israeli that died, 200 Palestinians dead or wounded. That's an extraordinary number. And it's hard to see, based on what the current policy of the Israeli government is and the IDF, how this ceasefire brings anything closer to a conclusion, because the conclusion that Israel wants for Gaza is no Palestinians in Gaza. And to just give a sort of an optic to that, because some people, when I talk to them about Gaza, they have a tough time saying, okay, Gaza's shrunk by 70% and people are getting squished. I said, think about a home. Let's say you got 5 people in your home and you had 3 bedrooms, a bathroom, living room, dining room, kitchen. And slowly, now you push everybody into 2 bedrooms, then into 1 bedroom. Then you get rid of the living room, then you get rid of the dining room, then you get rid of the kitchen. And now 5 people are living in the bathroom. That's sort of what's happened in Gaza. And for the Israelis, they're fine with that. So I'm just not incredibly confident that a 60-day ceasefire is going to bring anything good to the good to Palestinians. It might do something for Israel.
John, you said Israel is looking at, this situation where Israel does not want Palestinians in the occupied Gaza Strip. Do you think that could eventually happen, given what Trump has said previously as well? He has said that I want to create a Riviera of the Middle East. Do you think that could be a part of these negotiations? Because Israel has said that it has accepted it. Do you think Israel might put this little, issue, which everyone says that should not happen? The Palestinians should be in the occupied Gaza Strip. Do you think that Israel would make this a condition of this ceasefire deal? Do you think that could be a possibility?
I don't know if they'll make a condition. However, the language will be in the document, and President Trump will add language that will suggest that that's a part of, and I'm hesitant to even use this phrase, final solution, but that's sort of, what the state of Israel is looking for.
That's what Trump has said. This is the best and the final offer.
Exactly. Final offer, final solution, however you want to do it. I think the challenge, though, is that Egypt doesn't want the Palestinians. Jordan doesn't want the Palestinians. Lebanon doesn't want them. Syria doesn't want them. Qatar, UAE, Saudi Arabia doesn't want them. So where are they going to go? And the one thing that Israel has done is slowly, as they've condensed where the Palestinians are in Gaza, what have they done? Pushed north, south, east, north, south, and east. They're pushing them toward the Mediterranean. The only place left for the Palestinians to go is to jump into the Mediterranean Sea or to be offloaded by ships. But I think that from Israel's standpoint, the goal, specifically from some of the ministers in the state of Israel's government, is removing the Palestinians. And I think President Trump optically just sees, Beirut in Gaza and a Trump Tower and the whole bit. But he doesn't look that far. He's basically looking to tomorrow, to next week. He's not strategically thinking. Netanyahu, on the other hand, is more strategically thinking.
Mustafa, do you think Hamas is going to accept the ceasefire? Trump is going to pressure Hamas to accept the ceasefire, but do you think it's going to be viable given the number of deaths that we've seen in the occupied Gaza Strip and the Israeli atrocity that we see on a daily basis? Do you think it will be easy for Hamas to accept, or will it even accept it in the first place?
Omar, as you know, since October 7, 2023, Israeli security forces have been murdering more than 55,000 Palestinians, mostly women and children, living in the occupied Gaza Strip. And dire humanitarian situation is deepening day by day in Gaza. And we know that international criticism is mounting on Israel over the humanitarian tragedies in the occupied Palestinian territory. And at the end of May, United States and Israel launched so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation to deliver humanitarian aid packages to the war-weary Palestinians living in the war-torn Gaza Strip. But we know that Israeli security forces are taking aim at Palestinians waiting for the humanitarian aid packages delivered by the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. And yesterday, U.S. President Donald Trump announced that Israel agreed to ceasefire, 60-day ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. And he says that right now it is up to Hamas, except U.S. brokered, Egypt and Qatar brokered ceasefire. I don't think that Hamas will take the U.S. brokered ceasefire into the consideration, because we know that United States is trying to evacuate nearly 2 million Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip. But based on the realities, you cannot evacuate all Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip, as Kovlich claimed that no one wants to see Palestinians in their country. Egypt is against U.S. plan for Gaza's future. Jordan is also against Trump's so-called Gaza peace plans. Right now, I think Qatar and Egypt will pressure on Hamas to accept the ceasefire deal. On the other hand, since the very beginning of the crisis in the Gaza Strip, Turkey has been trying to increase international awareness about Israel's geopolitical agenda in the region. Turkey has been always calling for a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because we know that these 60-day ceasefire proposals are temporary solutions to the problems. If we want to deal with the security challenges in the region, I think we have to take the realities on the ground into the consideration, and Turkey has been always calling for two-state solution. Some Western countries are recognizing the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people. They are saying that they are ready to recognize the independence of Palestinian state. I think if the international community takes Turkey's security demands into the consideration, I think we will be able to see more prosperous future for the people living in the Middle East.
John, can we call the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation a humanitarian foundation when over 500 people have been killed by Israeli forces? Yeah. I would call it an organization. It's not even a humanitarian foundation. We don't even know the details behind this organization, who is supporting it, who is backing it. They've said that it's being backed by the United States and Israel, but that's not the solution to feed the people who are stuck, who are war-torn in the occupied Gaza Strip. How are you looking at this entire foundation? Do you think that this is a viable foundation or the right way to distribute aid? Because Palestinians are going to collect humanitarian aid, they're going to collect food, they're going to collect basic necessities, but when they're waiting in lines, when they're waiting in those queues, we've seen how they've been treated. The Israeli forces have shot at them. Some of them have had to return without food, without having access to anything in the first place. We know the United Nations cannot distribute this aid, distribute humanitarian aid or supplies because of Israel's blockade. What else can we look at? What other solutions do we have if we talk about providing aid to the war-torn Palestinians?
The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is run by a 41-year-old former acolyte of a conservative Reverend Jerry Falwell. He runs a PR company, public relations company. He doesn't have any experience in managing anything like this. This was set up, $30 million from the U.S., I don't know how much from the State of Israel, but it's not designed to help the Palestinians. It's designed to further enhance their inability to feed themselves. And it's awful to even ponder this, but for some in the government of Israel, the goal is to have less food, less water, less electricity, less gas, less everything going into Gaza, because the more of them that die, naturally or otherwise, the less of a problem it is. And it's awful to say that, but this foundation has basically given one meal per person per day for about a month or so. And they were at like 41, 46 million, and now they say they're at 51 million meals. But 4 distribution centers, they're spread out. People, as you said, they're walking long distances. They can't carry this stuff. Some of the people can't move because they're infirmed or they have injuries. And so everyone isn't getting anything.
John, sorry to interrupt you, but a few days ago, there were reports that narcotics are being transported in flour bags.
Yeah, and I don't know. But let's go with that report for a minute. Let's say they're in the cart. Are we going to say that all 50 million food boxes are full of fentanyl and ketamine and marijuana and heroin or whatever? I mean,
opium pills.
Yeah, it sort of defies belief that if something is happening, which do bad things happen? Sure. But if they're happening, where does that start? Well, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is responsible for creating these boxes and for securely moving them in. So where where is this stuff getting put in if it's happening? Is it outside of Gaza? Is it outside of the state of Israel? Is it within Israel where they're getting packed? And then you always have to ask, is it being done deliberately, precisely to create a story and then to delegitimize everyone's involvement? But I think it's worth saying again that the goal of this foundation is not really to help. It's about furthering the interests of Israel to constrain further the Palestinian people, keep pressing them into a smaller and smaller area, easier to control. So I'm not tremendously optimistic. And then the other final point, as a U.S. citizen, I don't want to see us spending $30 million on this. This is the responsibility of the taxpayers of the state of Israel. Israel destroyed almost all of Gaza in terms of infrastructure. Israel is the determinant for the hunger that is in Gaza. And so I don't want U.S. taxpayers to be paying for this. The same way President Erdogan has been the most vocal Muslim head of state since this happened October the 7th. And Turkish taxpayers don't want to be spending money on this either. Israel's got about $200 billion in foreign reserves. Well, now they need to start using it if they want this big, beautiful Riviera in Gaza.
Well, there's another thing, John, that I want to inform you about and our audiences. There's a $510 million arms sales to Israel for a precision guidance kit that has been approved by the United States as well. So the taxpayers would have to pay for more bombs, more destruction, and the Israeli genocide as well. Mustafa, I'll come back to you now. Qatar and Egypt are going to give the final say, give the final statement about the ceasefire. That's what Trump has said. So do you think that Qatar and Egypt now, after months of negotiations, even in the past few months, we saw that they were negotiating with both Hamas, United States, and Israel, but nothing really happened. Do you think that this time around, Qatar and Egypt would have, there would be a possibility that Qatar and Egypt could come to a comprehensive ceasefire?
Mar, we know that Qatari and Egyptian decision makers are playing important role to reach a ceasefire between Israel and Palestinian resistance group Hamas. But on the other hand, I think that there are only two options to deal with the security challenges posed by Israel in the region. And the first option is the United States. We know that the United States can be considered as the unique country in terms of convincing the Israeli decision makers to halt their military offensive in the region. But we know that extremist ideas are controlling the Trump administration right now, and some American senators are claiming that those who support Israel will be blessed by the God, and those who against Israel will be cursed. And it is clearly showing that we cannot count on the United States' role in the region in terms of ensuring peace and security in the Middle East. On the other hand, the second option is, I think, unity and solidarity among regional countries. And we, as we mentioned, that since the very beginning of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, Turkey has been taking steps to unite the regional countries in terms of dealing with the security challenges in the region. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan have been in close contact with their counterparts from the Middle Eastern countries to discuss what can be done against Israel's geopolitical agenda in the region, because Turkish decision makers thinks that Israel wants to be only regional hegemon in the Middle East, and Turkey has been always calling for cooperation and collaboration among regional countries to resist against Israel's geopolitical agenda in the region. I think Turkey will continue to take steps to ensure solidarity and unity among regional countries. As you know, Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan have been in close contact with his Egyptian and Qatari counterparts to discuss possible terms for permanent solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But as we mentioned, that the 6-day ceasefire proposed by the United States President Donald Trump will be only a temporary solution to the problem. And if we want to see a permanent solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I think we have to take the realities on the ground into the consideration, and we have to take our steps accordingly. And I think that Turkey will continue to prioritize dialogue and diplomacy in terms of bringing long-standing and sustainable peace and security to the Middle East.
Mustafa and John, thank you for that analysis on Gaza, on whatever's happening in the occupied Gaza Strip. I'll be right back with you guys. French President Emmanuel Macron has urged Russian President Vladimir Putin to begin peace talks aimed at ending the war in Ukraine. That was done during a lengthy phone call on Tuesday, their first direct conversation in nearly 3 years.
How are you? Do you have a good trip?
Russian President Vladimir Putin and French President Emmanuel Macron spoke by phone on Tuesday for the first time since September 2022, holding a substantial discussion on the conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East. The conversation lasted 2 hours and focused heavily on efforts to reach a ceasefire in Ukraine, as well as diplomatic solutions to the growing nuclear tensions surrounding Iran. The French president urged Putin to agree to negotiations aimed at ending the war in Ukraine and reaffirmed France's support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Ahead of the conversation, Macron also spoke with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and briefed him again afterward. On Iran, Macron underscored what his office called the serious nuclear threat posed by Tehran and stressed the importance of Iran cooperating with the International Atomic Energy Agency. Macron added that France was determined to find a diplomatic solution that would address Iran's nuclear program, missile activities, and regional role. The Kremlin, meanwhile, emphasized that Iran has a right to peaceful nuclear energy under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and said Putin had highlighted this during the call. On Ukraine, Putin repeated his claim that the war was a consequence of Western policies that ignored Russia's security concerns, and insisted any peace deal would have to account for what he described as new territorial realities, a reference to areas of Ukraine occupied by Russian forces. Both leaders agreed to keep open their lines of communication to pursue possible solutions on Ukraine and Iran.
Merci beaucoup.
Welcome back to the program. John, let's talk about Russia and Ukraine. You've spent a few weeks in Russia. The past few weeks you were in St. Petersburg and in Moscow. Firstly, tell me, how was the atmosphere over there? How are people reacting to this war, which has been ongoing? This is the 4th year of the Russia-Ukraine war. So tell me how the public sentiment is in Russia.
If you judge by the media, which of course the government controls, generally it is still very robust and supportive, and that Russian Federation will be victorious, primarily because Russia isn't only fighting Ukraine, it's fighting NATO, and it's fighting the European Union, and has done well. So there is this, this patriotism that the government has been very deft at managing and stage managing and producing. And it's important too to remember that the history of Russia, they were invaded during World War II. And a country that gets invaded like they did, like countries on the European continent during World War II, that is it's a transformative experience. And you learn how to live with pain. You learn how to be uncomfortable for the greater good. And that's basically what President Putin has said to his people. Now, in the public, you talk to people and they're tired because inflation is high. The government is spending an inordinate amount of money on the military, which he said recently he's going to decrease. And interest rates are high. Banks are paying 20%. You're borrowing money at 25%. Companies can't repatriate their funds, so they're reinvesting. And you're seeing a tremendous amount of money being reinvested in infrastructure. And that's going to be helpful to Russia if the economy does get worse in terms of trying to hold its positions in Ukraine, because infrastructure is usually the first thing that starts crumbling. In Russia's case, they've been rebuilding it these last 4 years. And then you have, from the government standpoint, and quietly, government officials are tired of this. They want it over. Company executives, they just want it finished because it's impacting their businesses. And at SPIEF, the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, prior to 2022, that was the biggest event. President Putin would come there. You would have heads of state, heads of government. You would have the heads of the largest corporations in the world that would be there signing deals. The deals would be multinational. 22, 23, 24, and 25, it's smaller. the heads of state and heads of government attending are smaller countries and less senior, and then global company executives, they just basically, aren't there. And the agreements that are being signed are mostly within Russia, Russia to Russia, Russian company to Russian company. So there is an impact, and I think that we're seeing the government of the Russian Federation trying to figure out that off ramp, and I think for some of them, it's pretty easy. We went in, we have 20% of Ukraine, let's call it a day. We've got everything we want, well, almost everything we wanted. We can say we beat NATO, say we beat the EU, start trying to figure out getting the sanctions lifted and move on. But for some, we're not done yet. And there are some really hardcore folks. So, but I think overall, we're on a trajectory toward how do we end this? And I think we'll see some real results this year.
John, we were talking about taxpayers right now. There's a good news for taxpayers. The Pentagon says that it will not be providing promised weapons to Ukraine because there was a review over military aid, and it said that there were stockpiles which were extremely low. So those weapons will not be delivered to Ukraine now. What happens in this case now? The taxpayers won't have to pay for those weapons. But on the other side, they are paying for the weapons in Israel, which is attacking Palestinians in the occupied Gaza Strip. So far, $66 billion have been spent by the United States on military aid for Ukraine. How do you see this? Do you think that this would, further, worsen relations between the United States and Ukraine? We know how Zelensky and President Trump have treated one another over the past few months. So do you think that this is going to be extremely, bad for the Ukrainians, because Trump is also pushing for the Europeans to take care of Ukraine? So how would that impact the relations between Trump and Ukraine and Trump and Europe?
The announcement from the Department of Defense, Eldridge Colby, who's Undersecretary of Policy, who's had outside of government before he was confirmed similar sort of positions with respect to Ukraine. Some of the, what they're talking about not delivering is out of current stocks, so that can actually happen. But others are in pipelines that the Ukrainians have contracted for. It isn't going to be delivered till next year and that. But is it, optically, is it bad? Yes. Tangibly, is it bad? Potentially. As we're on air, I have not heard how the Ukrainian government has responded. But if I could deliver a message to President Zelensky and Mr. Yermak, his head of office, please don't take the political bait. Simply say, we recognize the U.S. continues to focus on what it believes it needs to defend itself. We appreciate all the help that we've been given. We hope that there will be opportunities to get more help, but we're not going to second guess the United States Department of Defense and President Trump. I'm hoping that's going to be their statement. I'm not incredibly hopeful, because usually the Ukrainian government uses this type of an opportunity to blow it all up and to criticize President Trump, to criticize the Congress, to criticize U.S. taxpayers, and create another disaster, i.e., you're ungrateful. Mm-hmm. For the Europeans, though, from the U.S. perspective, this is part of that pressure policy, which is, we don't want to be doing this stuff. You should be doing more. You should be spending more, which then goes to NATO with their increasing the 5% total, 3.5% on direct military spending, 1.5% on indirect. So President Trump has always said, you people should be spending more, and particularly Ukraine is a European problem, not a Atlantic Ocean problem. So where I think that we're going to be over the next months is the U.S. Congress is going to try to encourage President Trump to deliver some things, particularly defensive missile capabilities. And one of the items mentioned were the Patriot batteries.
Patriots, yeah.
And it's not. Ukraine wants Patriot systems, which they said they paid for. Those are $1 billion each, and they take about a year to make. and there aren't that many of them. And the countries that have them, including the U.S., but European countries, we've talked about, President Zelensky has spent 4 years going to all these capitals and saying, if Russia beats us, they're coming at you next, so you better weapon up. And then he goes and says, by the way, I need you to give me your Patriots. And these countries are saying, well, wait a minute, you just told us we need to get ready to be attacked. Why would we give you a $1 billion system? So that's one problem. The missiles are about $1 million each. And that's what Ukraine needs. Now, the good news, though, is there are defensive kits that they've been getting from Europe, and they've been making themselves that have become very, very good. So it's in the short term, this is going to be more of an optic issue that it's going to upset the Ukrainians, it's going to demoralize the Ukrainians. And from Russia's standpoint, if you're President Putin, you're looking sort of back and you're saying, okay, President Trump said that escalating on Iran would help bring peace faster. Well, you're President Putin, you're looking at that going, okay, Donald, I'm going to escalate on Ukraine, hoping to bring peace faster.
Turkey has also been providing drones to Ukraine.
Yes.
And we all know Turkey is...
Bakhtiar, they're setting up it should be operational, I think, later this year, a factory in Ukraine.
The Bayraktar factory, yeah. So Turkey has been providing drones to Ukraine. Turkey has a balanced approach in this war. You know, it's siding with Russia as well, providing support to Ukraine as well. So, you know, we have seen this balanced approach. Mustafa, tell me about the Turkish point of view at this point. At the NATO summit, Turkish President Erdogan said that Hakan Fidan has been dealing with the Ukraine-Russia delegations and the ceasefire talks, or the peace talks, you might want to call it. How are you looking at the Turkish position, Mustafa? Because Erdogan said that, you know, there were some criticisms about the delegations not coming, the appropriate delegations not coming, the heads of states not coming. Zelensky and Putin did not. Zelensky was here, but Putin did not attend. So they were saying that, you know, these delegations they're not going to have any impact on these negotiations. But then Erdogan said that we are in the right direction. And what we expected from these meetings, we have achieved. The results are there. There was an exchange of prisoners of war. So, Mustafa, how are you looking at the Turkish position at this point?
Well, in February 2022, Russia launched its special military operations against Ukraine. And since then, Turkey has been taking diplomatic steps in terms of putting an end to the ongoing conflicts between Ukraine and Russia in the Eastern Europe, because Turkish decision makers reiterate at every opportunity that there will be no losers in a just peace, and there will be no winners at the ongoing and continued wars between two warring sides in the Eastern Europe. As you mentioned that last week, North Atlantic Treaty Organization leaders gathered in The Hague to discuss regional and international security challenges. And on the sidelines of the NATO summit, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan met with Western leaders, including US President Donald Trump and his French counterpart Emmanuel Macron. And President Erdogan reiterated Turkey's readiness to host new rounds of peace negotiations between Ukrainian and Russian delegations. We know that Turkey's financial and cultural capital, Istanbul, hosted several rounds of peace negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, but these negotiations didn't yield positive results in terms of reaching any ceasefire or peace deal between two warring sides, but it resulted in the exchange of prisoners of wars. But Turkey has been always calling for leader-to-leader diplomacy to reach a permanent ceasefire or peace deal, because Turkey believes that Russian President Vladimir Putin and Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky are supposed to meet each other to discuss possible terms for ceasefire or peace deals. Right now, there are several demands coming from both sides. Ukraine is calling for full withdrawal of Russian forces from the Ukrainian territories. On the other hand, Moscow is calling upon Kyiv to give up its political sovereignty and territorial integrity. I think these different security demands are supposed to be reconciled reconciled by mediator or facilitator actors, and Turkey has been trying to play an important role as facilitator or mediator between Ukraine and Russia, because we know that Turkey has been enjoying close relationships with both Ukraine and Russia in many fields ranging from politics and economy to military and trade. Turkey has been always reiterating its strong support for Ukraine's territorial integrity and political sovereignty. Turkey doesn't recognize the illegal annexation of Crimea by the Russian Federation in 2014. On the other hand, Turkey and Turkish decision makers are able to speak to both sides in the negotiating table. On the other hand, we know that United States President Donald Trump started his second term in January, and at that time he promised to halt Ukraine-Russia war within 24 hours. But right now there are nearly 6 months have passed, but the war is still continuing, and it is clearly showing that Trump failed to promise his foreign policy pledges in his presidential campaign. Turkey has been always calling for leader-to-leader diplomacy. Turkish foreign policy makers are trying to bring Zelensky, Putin, Trump together in Turkish capital Ankara or Istanbul. I think that Turkey will continue to take new diplomatic steps and initiatives in terms of facilitating peace talks between two warring sides, because Turkey believes that if there is something wrong in the region, it will spread to chaos to the other parts of the world, and it will pose a huge threat to international peace and security. I think Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan will continue to prioritize dialogue and diplomacy in terms of upholding international peace and security.
My last question for today, and John, I'm going to ask it to you. Israel and the United States attacked Iran. Do you think there was a need? Do you think that Iran was posing a threat to Israel, or, even if it was posing a threat to regional countries, do you think it was the right thing to do for the United States to attack Iran?
It's interesting how you phrase it, the United States attacking Iran, because the narrative over the last several weeks, if you ask most people on the street who attacked who, they will say, oh, Iran attacked Israel, and that it wasn't Israel that started it. It wasn't the U.S. that started it. I'm not certain that, it's sort of like the 60-day temporary ceasefire. What have you really accomplished other than moving in the book from one chapter to the next? Have you closed the book? And President Trump said, I'm escalating to de-escalate. Did Iran have a nuclear weapon, i.e. like North Korea? So they had a weapon, we want to destroy the weapon. The answer seems to be no, they did not have a weapon. Do they want to have a weapon? Some in the government do, some in the government don't. That's the same in every government. Does this move peace between Iran and Israel, between the U.S. and Iran, in any measurable manner? I don't think we know yet. What it does do, though, is when a country's under sanction like Iran, it's far easier for the government to mobilize a belief in patriotism and a belief in, okay, we may not like the government, but we really don't like being attacked by someone else because of the choices that we've made. And so, I thoroughly enjoyed watching the son of the late Shah of Iran being paraded about as he's going to go in there now, and now's the moment. And my work in Cuba has, shown the last 60 plus years, Cuban Americans in Miami every year. This year, we're gonna overthrow them. This year is Castro's last year. And then Fidel died. And then this year will be the last year of his brother. And then his brother died. And then the new president this will be the last year. And they just keep going. And so with the U.S. and Iran, I'm not certain that this moves the proverbial ball toward a true solution to the problem. because it was so much about optics, and President Trump even said that, the biggest ever, the largest ever. So for him, it's performative rather than how does it actually get you to the result you want? Because as we've seen, as we pointed out with, during the campaign, I'll have the war end in 24 hours. Then if I'm elected, I'll have it ended before I get sworn in. Now we're 6 months in, and the Ukraine-Russia war keeps going. So for him, it's about those moments. And I'm not certain that this is really going to be moving to the final chapter.
John Kavalich, thank you so much for joining us in the studio today. I know you have a very busy schedule, but taking the time out for us, it means the world to us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Anews editor Mustafa Kocakanar, it was an interesting experience to listen to your analysis as well and the Turkish perspective on all of these global issues.
You are welcome.
That brings us to the end of our program. Thanks for joining us. Bye for now.